understanding, insights into the views and circumstances of others, strength to seek what we believe in, humility to accept the combined decisions of others, patience, good humour at all times, tolerance and courtesy, while working in the best interests of our community. Apologies. We have apologies from Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Hills for absence. Councillor Clow, not Councillor Filipaina, who's here on time, and Councillor Newman for lateness. And congratulations to Councillor Filipaina for getting here on time. I move that we accept those apologies, seconded by Councillor Casey. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Declaration of interest. Is there any councillor that has an interest that they need to declare for today's agenda items? No. Kathy, Councillor Casey.
I am a member of, not a member, I am the SPCA ambassador on Auckland Council when it comes to the issue on dogs. I always declare that. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't, I think, prohibit you in any way from engaging in the discussion, and I'm sure it won't. Confirmation of minutes. We have one set of minutes for confirmation dated the 27th of June. I move that we confirm the ordinary meeting minutes of our meeting, and including the confidential items. I have a seconder, Councillor Simpson. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Petitions, there are none. Public input, none has been received, and therefore we come to item number 7, local board input, and there has been one request received from the Hibiscus and Bays local board, and I'll ask the Julia Parfitt to come to the table to speak to this input in relation to the dog management bylaw. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I have Janet Fitzgerald, our Deputy Chair, here too. I'm just going to comment very briefly,
welcome,
but
Janet. It's
not so much on the bylaw itself, it's just the unintended consequences of it for us. With the bylaw, particularly with the on-leash, off-leash situation, we're going to have to provide signage for off-leash areas. One member of the public in Hibiscus and Bays has worked out that that's going to require 251 signs to be erected in our local board area alone. And I'd just like you to consider that aspect, that maybe that signage needs to be a requirement of council if that's to be the case. And also in developing areas like ours where we have new reserves, the bylaw, what's the recommendation, and our board really is very happy with the bylaw. It reflects what our local residents largely said. But one outcome is that we would have to look and go into a public stage or consultation phase with each new reserve that comes on board, which will actually again be quite onerous and costly for the board as we have to publish that. So I just wanted to raise just two unintended consequences that maybe you might be able to resolve here today. And thank you very much. I nearly bypassed. There was a notice saying there was a workshop to how to work and communicate with your council. I nearly stopped there to know how to do it more effectively, but I would hope that you would listen to our concerns on those two issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've left before I asked if there were any questions.
Sorry,
but I know you wanted to make it brief. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'll ask Michael Sinclair to talk to that when he speaks to the main item. I think it's probably the best way to do it. Councillor Sayers, question.
Thank you, Julia. I guess if you scale that up across Auckland, as local boards, we could be looking at significant money. So thank you for bringing our attention to that.
Yes, signage is always a great cost to us. We're actually at the moment going through a process of changing so they uniform all of the signage in Hibiscus and Bays, and we can't even do it all within a 2-year time span.
I guess my question, Julia, would be, you've asked us today to try and find a solution to it.
Yes, I have.
Have you got a hint, a suggestion, something, a tip?
Well, perhaps at this point today, it would be a little bit too far to expect you to come up with a solution, but I think it's actually providing some funding to help local boards, if that's the decision you make, to actually extend the signage in all of those areas, or maybe to look at some other way of doing it. So your combined talents are far more than I can offer.
Thank you. Nice to see you too, Julia.
Thank you. Any further questions? No further questions. We'll move that we thank Julia and Janet for presenting to the governing body today. I have a seconder, Councillor Sayers. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. And in the meantime, Michael is at the back of the room listening to that submission and will incorporate his suggestions in the response when he speaks to the item later in the agenda. Okay, item number 8 is extraordinary business, and I've had foreshadowed from Councillor Kathy Casey that she wishes to raise the issue of ihu mātau. There's a good reason that it obviously isn't on the agenda, because it's an issue that has come to the forefront of our attention since the agenda was printed. It is an issue that is of wide public and media concern, and notwithstanding the fact that we have had a number of discussions on this body, I think it meets the requirements under standing orders to be discussed, and I think that I'm happy to accept that as an item on the agenda, item number 18, extraordinary business. I think we need to have a resolution to accept that, which is in front of us now. So I'll move accordingly. Kathy Casey, you'd like to second. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. We come now to item number 9, the first substantive item on the agenda, which is the update on the response of Auckland Transport to the recommendations of the Governance Framework Review. Ed Siddle is going to lead this, and we also welcome, I think I saw Shane from Auckland Transport. Thank you for being here today, and should it be required, and I think it probably will be later on in the meeting, we'll ask you to come to the table to answer any questions. But thank you for coming here at short notice. Really do appreciate that. I know as CEO you've got a lot on your plate. Right, Ed, you're going to lead off.
Yes. Good morning, Mr Mayor and all councillors. Sandra, I will get the presentation up if that's all right. Thank you. I've also got Class Sandstrom here from Local Board Services to answer any particular questions you might have around the Local Board engagement plans or the Local Board Transport Capital Fund process. I'll just make some introductory remarks to frame the discussion this morning. The Governance Framework Review began in 2016 to recognise and explore the balance in the shared governance model that we operate here at Auckland Council. In particular, it was to explore the role of local boards, and with a particular emphasis this morning on the role of Auckland Transport in relation to local boards. This report back was requested to report back on some previous resolutions around Auckland Transport's engagement with local boards and also with ward councillors. So the report back this morning is in 3 key areas, which are on the presentation there. It's around the local board engagement plans, it's around an improved process for the increase in the Local Board Transport Capital Fund, and it's about active engagement with ward councillors by Auckland Transport, with the ward councillor protocols being a particular output of that discussion. I'd like to say there are already some very positive things happening in terms of the engagement that Auckland Transport does. We've got the Waiheke pilot, which has just started recently. There was an MOU signed between Auckland Transport and the Waiheke Local Board. I think this is right. Shane will correct me that there is an operations manager role to be started, which is still being developed. And I think there's also a transport plan being launched today. Is that? Yes, a transport plan being launched today for Waiheke Island. Obviously on Tuesday we also discussed the commitments that Auckland Transport has made around engagement through the statement of intent. But again, as we discussed, we all know that making those commitments is not sufficient, and really what's key is how Auckland Transport goes about implementing those commitments. Just turning to the specific elements relating to local boards. The local board engagement plans, this is actually a standard requirement under the governance manual for council-controlled organisations, but I think the feeling of the governance framework review process was that there needed to be a new plan for Auckland Transport with local boards that was a bit more specific in recognising the role of local boards in local placemaking. So the engagement plan that is one of the appendices to this report reflects those governance framework review principles around the local placemaking role. And again, I think the key here is that what we need to see now is that is rolled out around the local boards and is implemented successfully. There's probably a feeling that the Waiheke pilot's quite important here, and that could be a model for some wider application around the city in some parts of the region where there are particular areas of character, potentially Rodney, Franklin, maybe Waitakere ranges, but obviously that's for Auckland Transport to explore. Those engagement plans are supported by work programs that are being put in place. They largely reflect the known activities that will happen in different local board areas, but will be supplemented by things that are worked on with the local boards, such as the Local Board Transport Capital Fund, which is the next item. And the key resolution was around putting in place a more systematic process for allocating funds and choosing projects under the Local Board Transport Capital Fund, which, as you recall, the governing body increased the sum of to 20 million total each year across the 21 local boards. Essentially, the improved process revolves around having a good strategic sense of what each local board wants to achieve, then identifying projects that would potentially fit with that strategic direction, and then using Auckland Transport's expertise alongside the local board to help decide which projects both have a strategic fit and are potentially able to be actioned within the budget available. Again, we're at a stage where what we need to do now is make that improved process work. The third element I just want to talk about this morning is the engagement with the ward councillors, with governing body. As you know, this is a well-recognised issue. We had a lengthy discussion on 16 April as part of the Statement of Intent shareholder comment meeting. We obviously had our discussion on Tuesday where some of these issues were raised. And we also had the workshop down at Auckland Transport on 24 June, which, engagement between Auckland Transport and councillors and local boards was the key subject to that. I think it's important, of course, to remember Auckland Transport has a massive program of work. At any one time, there's just hundreds of activities going on around the region. So it's about getting a balance between the information that flows to you and the information that the community needs to understand what Auckland Transport is doing, but Auckland Transport's need to actually deliver on the priorities you've set for them and be nimble when circumstances demand it. So it's about getting that balance right. As I mentioned before, the Statement of Intent now has some significant commitments by Auckland Transport to keep improving its engagement, and I think that's a very positive thing. And supporting that is the Ward Councillor protocols, which are attached as one of the appendices to the report, and I'm sure we'll have some discussion about that shortly. So just in conclusion, I think the staff view would be that Auckland Transport's made some significant progress in responding to the resolutions made around the governance framework review. They're a really good basis to work from to continue to keep improving the level of engagement both with local boards and with governing body. Everybody, Auckland Transport, I'm sure governing body and local boards all recognise that there's a lot more to be done and that this is an evolving relationship between us all, and that we are partners in this. It is a massive work program that Auckland Transport have got to do, and they can't do it without your support. But equally, they need to be supplying information to communities and businesses and residents to really deliver on that successfully. So just in terms of the next steps, there is another workshop coming up on the 7th of August where some of the subjects to be discussed will include Auckland Transport's capital program. There's the OLIs, the One Local Initiative programs, especially the ones around transport, obviously. And there's also some discussion expected around roading maintenance contracts, and some of that may include the standards for engagement by contractors. We've got obviously the new quarterly reporting, which I mentioned the other day. That has a section on Auckland Transport's engagement. I think the next quarterly reporting meeting is 17 September. And then finally, what I've recommended in this report that you consider is that the next report back on these resolutions should happen in the first quarter of 2020. So we will look to be coming back to you and reporting on the progress that's been made at that point. So that's all I've got to say. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions, and I don't know if Shane wants to add anything to what I've said or correct anything, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I might ask you to come up, Shane, if that's okay. Just to get it on the board, I'll move the recommendations. Councillor Simpson seconded, and just to advise councillors, I've had some amendments foreshadowed by Councillor Simpson that I'll seconded by Councillor Collins that Councillor Simpson will speak to in due course. But first of all, we have questions. Any questions to Ed arising out of this? Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Your Worship. And thank you, Edward. And just want to acknowledge you, Shane, because I don't know if you mentioned this, I didn't catch it in your presentation, but another initiative that's in place is these Auckland Transport Councillor Clinics. They're held every week on a Thursday morning, and there's always a senior manager from Auckland Transport available to councillors. It's ad hoc. We can just walk in and make those appointments. Sometimes a senior manager from Auckland Transport has nobody turn up, but they turn up. So I just want to acknowledge that and mention it, and to thank you, Shane, for making that available. I've used it. I know a number of councillors around the table have used it, and it's been very productive. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I've got a couple of questions. The first in relation to the process around local boards and their decision-making around their local transport capital fund. Can you confirm that the process is such that the full board resolves on the projects and it's not just left to one board member as the transport spokesperson to agree the projects?
Yes, that's correct. The full board will make a decision on the final project or projects.
So just a process perspective, so that would be done earlier rather than later. The reason I've done some work talking to other local boards around this. There is potentially at the moment what's happening is maybe a transport spokesperson, one person says, I want this done. There's a whole lot of work and money and time and effort spent on it. Comes to the full board and actually that project doesn't have full support. So just kind of wanted to make sure that our process wasn't wasting anybody's time. We're refining it, so can you give me confidence that the full board are sort of brought in at those early stages?
Absolutely, and that's part of the discussion we've had when we developed this process, in the sense of making sure that early on at the identification of project stage, the full board is sitting around the table with Auckland Transport, identifying projects, and then as it goes through the process of high-level assessment from Auckland Transport, going to prioritisation of what sort of short list of high-priority projects they want Auckland Transport to look into the design and costings, to then take to decision making. At all those stages, it's a local board and not specific representatives. And how we're trying to do that too is it will be the same process every year. So local board teams will get used to how the process works year on year in. It will also make sure that together they're driving the process, in the sense that Auckland Transport and the boards together meet a workshop at an early stage. But where I guess the difference is how it's been previously compared to the new processes, it's less ad hoc. So we'll come working together with a program, the local board works program. So we'll follow that program. So come July, there will be these projects on the line as well. So we'll follow the normal work program process.
Yeah, my point was just as long as it's got majority of the board support. My next question is to you, Shane. And look, I just want to make sure that when we're looking at suggestions, it's practical for you and we don't set expectations that you can't meet. So are you happy with a response to a email or written request for Auckland Transport for a response acknowledgement to be 2 working days? And are you happy for the response to written inquiries be within 20 working days, noting that if a response is particularly onerous, like someone wants a, I think, roundabout instead of, nothing, that cannot be properly responded to in 20 days. But in the majority of sort of normal cases, 20 working days is within something that you feel comfortable that Auckland Transport can respond to?
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr Mayor. Yes, generally that's the case. There are some, you've mentioned one of them, there are some unique requests we get from time to time, or not from time to time, actually relatively regularly. And to give you, just to make it real for councillors, one at the moment was we've had a petition which involved a particular local board where they'd like us to look at dynamic laning on a main arterial. That is clearly something we're just not equipped to do in 20 business days. But generally, yes.
Your response in that 20 business days would be, look, this is bigger than your normal, this will take X time. So the person has an expectation and just doesn't hear nothing because you haven't done it. That's all. Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wayne Walker.
I'm just seeking some clarity on something, and when I read the document, it makes a lot of reference to projects. When it comes to issues with local boards, one of the critical things that we're experiencing in our local board is around sales of land, where that land involves transport. For example, recently there's been an issue over the sale of some land that would severely compromise a highly critical part of Whangapara Road. There are other instances in our ward where there's the sale of land at marinas that can significantly impact on transport, ferries, park and rides and the like. They're not defined as projects, as far as I know. Maybe projects are defined more widely. So I'm just wanting some assurance around how the engagement with local boards, the no surprises, the local knowledge, all of those things fit with those issues. And sometimes they involve not just one CCO, which is Auckland Transport, but often also Panuku and conceivably other CCOs, and it becomes even more difficult. Question clear? So does projects cover off these issues that go to transport?
From my perspective, no, they don't. The land process in terms of sale of land is not something that's managed by AT. If you're requesting something for AT to take on that is beyond what our responsibilities are, it becomes more challenging for us.
So I'll just address this question more broadly to Edward. Given that this is a very significant issue for local boards, it's a very significant issue for the community, it goes to this engagement process that we have here between local boards and transport. Is it possible to widen this process so it captures off these sorts of issues?
Just while you're thinking of an answer to that, if I understand your question correctly, Councillor, this is disposal of land that may have been held by Auckland Transport, but the disposal process and engagement around it is handled by Panuku. I think that's the answer.
Yes, it's handled by Panuku, but Panuku is operating off information given to it by Auckland Transport. So Auckland Transport may say, oh, there isn't a problem here. In point of fact, the local board may say, there's a huge problem here. The community may say there's a huge problem, and the resolution essentially goes to all the principles that you've got in here. No surprises, collaboration and the like. So what I'm saying is this is a very effective document. It's effective for dealing with projects. It's actually talking about engagement, so the scope of it needs to be somewhat wider.
I think I'm not that familiar with the processes around land and land disposal in council, and I would be reluctant to widen this process to allow for that engagement. What I suppose I would say is I think it's open to any local board to raise issues with council officers, and they will do what they need to do to find the answer and help the local board work through those issues. I don't think this is the process to raise those sort of concerns.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Mayor, what I'm raising is a process that goes to this CCO. I'm quite certain that this form of engagement and this template that currently is focused on Auckland Transport will also be replicated across other CCOs, like Panuku, like RFA and the like. My concern is that we anticipate that and we ensure that it's working across all of those CCOs, and in instances where those CCOs together are engaging with local boards. Otherwise, we end up with the common problem that we've got in this council, where it is impossible for communities to deal with council because issues involve multiple parts of council. The council, maybe parks, maybe Panuku, maybe Auckland Transport. It's a nightmare.
I can answer that potentially. The governance manual for CCOs does include expectations around all CCOs and their engagement with both local boards and governing body. At present, the governance manual is relatively light in terms of its expectations. It talks about when major projects are happening that there should be engagement. I think one of the things that our team is looking to do in the next year on our work program is re-look at the governance manual and perhaps beef up some of those expectations and make it clearer about when CCOs should engage. And I suspect that might help alleviate some of those concerns, because one of the things that we could talk about, of course, is when there are issues that cut across multiple CCOs that we should all be working together. So I do think there is something there.
Thank you. I want now to move to comments, and I invite Councillor Simpson, who's got some amendments. If we scroll up the screen, you'll be able to see what the amendments are to speak to those amendments.
So thank you, Your Worship. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to congratulate Auckland Transport, who are probably piloting something with me by way of improving communication as to transport projects that are happening in our wards. So if you have a look at page 19 of your written agenda, where we were talking about the expectations for Auckland Transport with regards to councillors, all we're saying, all I'm suggesting here by way of these amendments, which have been seen and approved by, my understanding is, with Auckland Transport and with Ed and his team, is the fact that ward councillors are offered, have the same information that the local boards get on their on the transport projects happening in their ward. The service level of X days, I asked in my questions. Auckland Transport have acknowledged, I had originally put 48 hours, Auckland Transport have acknowledged 2 working days and 20 working days for the average response time. But everything else is really the same. An opportunity for us to have an input into the decision making on the transport fund, noting that the decision making is local boards themselves. Just must, you know, people come to us and say, you know, why is this transport, why are you doing this in your ward? It's just a quick process. You'll be able to know all that the local boards know, acknowledging that they are the decision making, but just keeping us better informed. It's just an abridged version.
Thank you. Now, as Chair, I've accepted those amendments for discussion, so they're part of the substantive recommendations. Councillor Darby, and then I've got two others.
Just a question. I get information from Auckland Transport really easily, and I appreciate that. I just go through the right channel, and it's all recorded. But the question really is the third bullet point. That should be an agreed minimum level of service, because if that was the agreed level of service, that would be worse, Shane, than what your staff currently provide to me and Councillor Hills. I get things turned around a lot more promptly than that. So if the councillor can actually qualify that, it's an agreed.
It's a maximum.
Yeah, it's a level of service. So it's a minimum level of service.
Yeah, I accept that, Your Worship. Yeah.
And
Good point.
just briefly, Chair. I mean, I just don't put my battle fatigues on when I deal with Auckland Transport, and it really does make a difference if you don't go to them with your battle fatigues and fully armed and fisticuff ready. It's amazing how if you establish relationship and you maintain relationship and you test that relationship at times. Shane, I've had to test it, but if you're always focused on the outcome, it's amazing what Auckland Transport will show up with.
I think that's a fair point, and certainly nothing in this would detract from the first approach being a direct approach and discussion. I've heard Councillor Cooper talk about how effective that's been for her in the past as well, and that will often resolve it, and that will be the best way of doing it. So these are kind of minimum standards, in part to address the concerns that have been raised about the turnaround in correspondence when formal correspondence has been entered into. Councillor Cooper, next on my list.
Thank you. I think this is a good way forward, and thank you, Shane and Edward, for creating the Appendix B there, the councillor input. There are lots of mentions about local boards in the councillor protocol, which is quite interesting. Anyway, what I'm not comfortable with is 20 working days is a month. It's a business month. It's too long. Quite often when we get either complaints or queries from constituents, they've already been given a number, take a number and wait, and they've taken another number, and then they've waited and waited. And so quite often it's a month or 2 months down the track already. And then if we say another month, I just think that's too long, personally. I think 2 working weeks, at least an update why you haven't got it. Because I think sometimes what happens is we are waiting, and then, more stuff keeps coming in, and you've got to try and keep a track of what you've asked for because it's so long. And that's the issue. And then the person from the public comes back to you, have you heard anything? Have you heard anything? And you're constantly chasing, and I don't think that's good service. Councillor Simpson, I just think 20 working days that's a month.
I get that. I actually had 10 and I was asked to make it 20. So do you want to try 3 weeks?
Yeah, but who's this for? Sorry, Mr. Chair, who is this for? Is this for us serving the public to get responses, or is this, you know, it's got to be a compromise, and I don't think that a month is a compromise.
Okay, if I can just comment on that briefly. Any figure is arbitrary, but what we're talking about is maximum length of time, and depending on the complexity of the problem, I would assume that the reply may be forthcoming much earlier than that, and following the approach that Councillor Darby has just spoken on, where something is urgent and where people have that level of frustration, usually what I think most of us have found, a telephone call to say, hey, look, this is really urgent, can you get onto it, does hurry the process up. But 20 working days, I suppose it's in line with what we are required to respond on under things like Lagoima. It's a standard period. So it's a standard period, but it's a maximum period. It's not the minimum period. And I think we can deal with the sort of situation that you've quite rightly raised within those standards. Councillor Wayne Walker.
So I've only asked a question, I haven't spoken, so I'm suggesting a few words that might be added to Councillor Simpson's amendment, and that's under bullet point 1. I was looking at bullet point 2, I didn't realise 1 was there, so bullet point 2, where it reads, are informed and offered briefings on all projects, if we could add the words, and changes to projects. Because the problem that we're experiencing with local boards is sometimes there's a change to the project, and that change can be quite fundamental, and that change is what needs to be consulted with the local board. So it's not just around the project, because everybody may have agreed to a project 10 years ago, but then there's a change to it, and it can be significant. So just those words, and changes to projects. Would you be happy with that?
Councillor, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Councillor Sayers.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to clarify that will be accepted within the amendments.
Thank you.
Sayers.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a question that's a clarification question, but I do support the amendment. And my question to Councillor Simpson, just for clarification for councillors, Auckland Transport and staff in general, around the last bullet point, I think it's H, if we could just scroll up to that. I just want to be clear about the intent of what you mean by recognising the source of the funding of these projects. When I read that, I assume you mean the funding's coming from the governing body or Auckland Council. Just if we could clarify that for the record, Councillor.
Correct. That's exactly. We've doubled the Transport Capital Fund. It's now significant, probably, on average, about $1 million in every local board area. So, yes.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, team, for the work you put into this. I don't have a huge issue with the recommendations from Councillor Simmers as far as amendments concerned. The 20 working days does fit within the Lagoima protocols. However, I'd also like to back up what Councillor Darby said. It's all about the relationships here, and no matter how quickly and effectively you want Auckland Transport to relate, it's all about how we treat them and how they treat us. It's about mutual respect and how you go about your work. And I would say if there are issues, we probably need to look in the mirror a little bit harder than what we do looking at Auckland Transport. That would be my comments, Mr. Mayor. This should be a work in progress, and I thank Auckland Transport and the councillors for putting this work forward, and Ed for putting it together.
Thank you very much. So I'll put the resolution as amended. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Declare that carried, and thank the team for the work, and Shane, thank you for being here and taking